All right, you guys. So, welcome back to the show. I have a great guest with me today, Dave Murphy. Um, so, first and foremost, you guys, I actually meant to reach out to Dave like many years ago at this point. It's been probably like 4 years after I saw him be a guest on Paul Check's Living 4D podcast. And I was kind of a guest shortly after. And I'm like, dude, this guy's message is so cool. I need to reach out to him. And then, like, 1 week goes by, I'm like, I'll do it next week. Another week goes by, I'll do it next week. And then all of a sudden, 4 years, and I'm like, that's it. I'm going to do it
Oh,
this week. And sure enough, I did. And luckily we got to connect. But Dave has gone on a great journey to help people, open their eyes about the myths of safe pesticides, especially kind of the herbicide Roundup and its active ingredient, glyphosate. And unfortunately, it's kind of, Dave, I'm going to let you take over pretty soon, but it's kind of sad that it's 2024 and we still have to try to convince people that all these chemicals are harmful to them. And
sure.
unfortunately, because of the explosion of social media and TikTok, you have like a lot of kind of influencers, especially from like the science kind of background or the MD background, coming out and saying, these chemicals are safe, although honestly, like complete formulations have never been tested for safety, especially like food science babe. That's her name. She
Sure.
claims to be extremely data driven. The
Yeah.
same with Dr. Eads, but I feel these are all data free assumptions, and they're not driven by data whatsoever. So we'll kind of focus a bit on the active ingredient glyphosate, which is in
Sure.
a herbicide called Roundup, which is part of a class of pesticides or biocides, whatever you want to refer them to. But I'll let you take over. So just give us a background of how you even got into this space and the activism space. And first and foremost, thank you for doing it. I really appreciate it. And
Thank you very
go ahead.
much. I appreciate it. Well, Eugene, thank you very much for having me on. I mean, I'm a huge fan of your work as well. I listened to your interview with Paul Check. I guess it was 4 years ago. It's hard to believe. Time flies. I guess that's what happens when you're locked down with COVID and other things that pop up. But I'll just say, I greatly appreciate your book on factory farms and in trying to advise people on where to find healthy meat and good companies that are doing the right thing. I moved back to Iowa in 2006 to help fight factory farms. They were going to build a 5,000 head factory farm half a mile from my sister's farm. And I was working as a technology consultant in the Department of Labor technology division. And the really shocking thing was I'm from Iowa, and this is 2006. So these things had popped up in a 10-year period. They'd gone from no factory farms um, to hundreds and then thousands of them. So that for me was my wake up call. My dad asked me, literally, I'd gotten an MFA in creative writing. I was supposed to be finishing my novel then, 2006. And I was in DC and I was really surprised. My dad called me up and said, I think we're going to need you to come home to work on a local state Senate race. And my family's Republican. And so ironically, the Republicans in Iowa have been very large supporters of industrial ag and Farm Bureau and factory farms and genetically engineered crops and Monsanto and Bayer. So one thing is I moved back to Iowa and I was really shocked because I go to all these town hall meetings and normally in Iowa, people are very respectful and very polite, especially in these rural communities. But I witnessed a very shocking culture change in a 10-year period. I moved to New York City to go to grad school in 1996. By 2000, and in rural America, farmers were friendly, they shared information, they worked together. But when they started building factory farms, there was like an appalling silence that went over through the farmers in rural America. And also that coincided with the rise of genetically engineered crops by Monsanto. At the same time, Monsanto was bullying farmers
Mhm.
and sending them threatening letters, basically, and asking them to basically narc on their neighbor if they believed that they were illegally planting GMO seeds. And Percy Schmeiser is one of those famous. I think he's a Canadian farmer that got quote unquote busted planting seeds, and there was huge Supreme Court case in Canada for him saving seeds that had blown on his farm inadvertently, and so he saved them and planted that. It was a huge lawsuit. So for me, I got involved in 2006 fighting factory farms, and I grew up going to farmers' houses for Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner. A lot of my friends were farmers, and farm kids. And I would, I spent a lot of time sometimes doing chores on my friend's farm if I spent the weekend there. So I have a lot of respect for America's family farmers, and I know how difficult they have it to make. They are really, a lot of people in America don't really understand, especially people that live on the East and West Coast and that are involved in the environment. They don't understand the economic pressure that a farmer is under by their local bank, and they take on massive debt loads. And so my take on this is Farm Bureau, the Corn Growers Association, the Soybean Association, Monsanto and Syngenta, Bayer, and now a whole host of companies, they have kind of locked farmers into this system that is not economically beneficial for them. It's actually they're in a debt trap, especially when they build giant factory farms. The interesting thing is the pork industry, pork growers, they have manipulated the farm bill and our political system. So every factory farm used to get a $250,000 grant from the USDA to build what was called an environmental containment pit. It's basically an Olympic-sized pool that these hogs or chickens and hogs, they are on concrete platforms with slats in them. And so for 6 months, they'll live there and they'll urinate and they'll defecate in these massive pools. And I'm saying, and it putrefies. And so there's horrible smells all over rural America that never existed, especially in Iowa. And for me, Iowa is it's a really beautiful, rich landscape. And technically, there's 30 million acres of farmland. It's one of the most terraformed landscapes on the planet, all done to conform to the whims of industrial agriculture. So I understand farming culture. I know why farmers make these decisions. Inherently, they're smart businessmen, but just like Wall Street will do credit default swaps and they'll do corrupt mortgages, just like we had the housing implosion in 2008, 2007, 2008, we will have a collapse in modern agriculture if we do not change things. And I'll say, I greatly appreciate your book that you've done on factory farms. I'd love to get into that. Love to hear some of your thoughts on that. But here we're talking about Roundup, which is Monsanto's flagship product. It's a herbicide. It came out in 1974, I think, 74 initially. And then in 1996, when they genetically engineered corn and soybeans to be resistant or tolerate glyphosate, it became widely adopted in the Midwest because allegedly they pitched it as extremely safe and non-toxic to the environment. They said it rapidly biodegrades. Actually, I think they lost a lawsuit to New York State on the biodegrading question, and they lost a lawsuit in France on the safety question. So there's a lot to dig into here. And, most people do not understand that they don't have to eat a GMO food. So, the main commodity crops that are genetically engineered are corn, soybeans, alfalfa, canola, sugar beets. Those are the main top commodity crops that are genetically engineered. They also have papaya, but basically 90%, 95% of the crops that are genetically engineered that are planted on base acres in the US and now abroad in foreign countries, they're genetically engineered to survive being sprayed with Roundup, whose main chemical ingredient is glyphosate. And so we can talk about glyphosate in Monsanto for 30 years said this is the safest herbicide on the planet. It's non-toxic to humans. It doesn't harm animals. And lo and behold, in 2015, after 30 years of bullying scientists and silencing them whenever they showed harm, in 2015, the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer, they came out and they declared glyphosate a class 2 to a carcinogen, basically meaning that it has the potential to cause cancer in humans. They made a very specific also difference because they said there was definitive proof that it does cause glyphosate by itself causes cancer in lab rats and animals. So that was a very careful distinction because they knew they were going to get sued. They knew they were going to have a lot of pushback from the industry. And actually, the saddest thing that I've ever seen in American democracy, besides the lockdowns and the COVID mandates, apologize for me mentioning that, what I'll just say is watching our elected officials in Congress and in state capitals across the country shut down our democracy and try to make it so you cannot find out how toxic this chemical that's widely sprayed on our food actually is. So,
Mhm.
the leading cancer agency on the planet declares glyphosate carcinogenic and harmful to humans and knowingly harmful to animals, and Congress rolls over. They just roll over, and rather than stand up for the American people, they go after the cancer experts that made this scientific discovery. So I'll just say that's a quick introduction, and it might be quite a bit. I know I've thrown out a lot of statistic and facts here, but I think this is one of the most important issues of our time. I think it intersects with um, democracy, human health, politics, and the environment. And most people do not know that when they're eating Cheerios or they're feeding Cheerios to their children, they're feeding them one of the most toxic foods on the planet that's
Mhm.
harmful to a child's gut microbiome. So, like, I'm 55 years old. Technically, I'm Gen X, but millennials and Gen Z, they have massive food allergies and massive gut health issues. And there's also there's been like the last 10 years, there's some mysterious rise in colon cancer for people 30 and under. And
Mhm.
also there's massive infertility issues. So that's a lot to unpack. I apologize for that's giving you a quick deep dive into the science on that, but I know you know quite a bit, and so I'd love to hear any questions.
No, Dave, you can go any directions you want. So don't even feel like scripted or constricted or anything. Well, like for example, I guess we can cover a lot of like myths of safe pesticides, you know? So a lot of
Yeah.
times, like influencers I mentioned, Food Science Babe, they're very kind of quote unquote data driven. But my
But
speculation is that
it's like tobacco science. It's just like tobacco science. Tobacco scientists lied to about the safety of tobacco for 30 years. They testified in Congress. They knowingly lied under oath. And the problem is these scientists today, they don't do their own research. That woman on like she's not doing research on glyphosate. She's repeating Monsanto and now Bayer's talking points. And so the industry, just like the tobacco industry and big food and big pharma, they have a playbook for how they distribute propaganda, and they confuse the mainstream media. They confuse the mainstream media, they confuse elected officials, and then they use that to create a smokescreen with the American public.
yeah, regarding the smoking part, is it's funny how for decades doctors sponsored or researchers sponsored by big tobacco, you know, would
Yeah,
shame any doctor or any researcher that came out and said, hey, this might actually be toxic, you know, people
yeah,
putting, you know, toxic smoke like right near their face multiple times a day a lot of times, and they would shame them and call them quacks, you know, and blah blah blah. And this happened with so many different chemicals. Like DDT is a good example, you know, with
yeah,
Silent Spring. I forgot her
absolutely.
Carlson. I forgot her first name, but Carlson. Some
Rachel Carlson,
yeah,
yeah,
Rachel Carson. For decades, you people are like spraying this insecticide on kids
yeah,
directly because all the
sure,
experts said it's totally fine,
yeah,
scientifically proven to be safe. And then, you know, 10, 20 years goes by. Ah, actually, we made a mistake. It's actually really toxic. And same thing with like BPA, you know,
oh
plastics.
yeah.
Uh, Asbestos is super popular. I mean,
Yeah,
for
asbestos are everyone's favorite. I'm just kidding, but
yeah, but that one wasn't even toxic on the LD50. And that's for 3 decades. They said, dude, it's not
yeah,
even toxic on the LD50. It's completely fine,
yeah,
you know? And everyone that spoke against it were like not data driven, not real
yeah,
scientists, you know, had an agenda, blah, blah, blah. But uh, one thing, one thing I think that's confusing, and you brought up a good point, is a lot of these people aren't doing their research and they don't really understand the kind of politics that goes behind actually doing this research. I think one of the confusing parts is a lot of times, a lot of these kind of data driven gurus or online gurus or whatever don't understand that complete
yeah,
formulations of pesticides are never tested for safety. It's just the isolated ingredient in isolate isolated active ingredient in isolation on its own, which in reality is never even used that way in farming. So like glyphosate is so weak it can barely kill any weeds on its own. But then when you incorporate those inert or inactive ingredients, it becomes so strong that you can kind of breathe this stuff in the air and all the weeds end up dying quickly. So that
Yeah,
totally makes sense because that's what the active ingredients are there for, because the average consumer thinks they're taking the complete product and testing that.
yeah.
And that is
Oh,
what's
absolutely.
determined for safety. But maybe you can touch on that.
No, listen, it's a very weird, archaic, and intentionally rigged regulatory system. I would say it's designed not to find harm. It's designed to intentionally approve toxic products for corporate profits. And that's, for me, that's a really sad statement. I wish I didn't have to make that. But all evidence points to that direction. You can start out looking at glyphosate, the very original studies. There are two very famous labs that conducted the original studies in the 1960s and 70s, and they were both convicted for fraudulent science. They actually had to be thrown out. One is it's Industrial Biotest Laboratories in the 1970s. They conducted 22 toxicological studies, and they found that like 35 to 40% of those studies were fraudulent. So, and Bio/Dynamics is another lab, very clever name. I'm just saying biodynamics, which I'm
Mm-hmm.
a fan of. So, but their name of the lab. So what they did is when they showed harm in an animal study, rather than use the data and keep that animal and dissect it and show what was wrong with it, they would toss it out of the study. So if an animal got sick in some of these studies, they would throw it out, which just messes 100% with the scientific accuracy of that and the data of that study. So those are two famous cases. But the other thing we have is rigging of the regulatory system, the democratic process by which, and so there's a lot of good people that work in our federal agencies. I truly believe there's a lot of great people that work at the USDA, that work at the EPA and the FDA, and they have our best interest at heart. However, in the political process, when a party or a president wins the White House, they get to bring in political appointees to sit over the department. And one of the most famous cases of this revolving door is Michael Taylor. So he was a Monsanto attorney that actually helped Monsanto write and rig the regulatory process to state that these new genetically engineered crops, genetically engineered soybeans and corn, which never existed before in the human food supply, basically said that they're substantially equivalent to the same corn and soybeans that humans have been eating for thousands of years. And just technically looking at that statement, that's like three-card Monty with science, if you ask me. If you then the funny story is I helped lead these GMO labeling battles. We had four ballot initiatives in a 3-year period, and we introduced legislation in 26 different states in a 5-year period to label genetically engineered foods. And the funny thing is, at the patent office, Monsanto and Syngenta declare that this new genetically engineered trait within these seeds is so novel that they get to be recognized as a
Mm-hmm.
patent holder for 20 years. And then they slide over to the FDA or the USDA and they magically claim that this is substantially equivalent, that there's no scientific difference between a traditionally bred crop or a hybrid and a genetically engineered crop. So that is just one of the levels of chicanery that is taking place in our democracy. And so Michael Taylor, he came in, I can't remember who, I think he was appointed under the Clinton administration, and he took over the FDA, and he helped rig the rules and make sure that more GMO crops were approved. Yeah, it was 1995 and 96, so that would have had to be Bill Clinton. But previously, he worked at a law firm that was represented by Monsanto. So you have fraudulent science on the safety of Roundup and glyphosate, and like you said, they don't test the entire formulation of Roundup. It's only for Roundup when you sell that weed killer, which is sprayed on it's sprayed on 300 million acres of farmland here in the United States. It's also sprayed on probably 20, 30 million acres of lawns and garden products. People use it, on their driveway. And so it's everywhere because for 30 plus years, Monsanto's gotten away with claiming it's perfectly safe. The other aspect is when in, I think 2012 through 2015, they were supposed to publish, which is, I don't know, every 15 years, they do a regulatory review of all the new and latest science. And so that came up at the end of the Obama administration in 2015 and 2016, where the EPA was reviewing all the new peer-reviewed science that had shown that glyphosate was toxic. And so they had say, and so this came out in the lawsuits. I'm sure you know about all the Monsanto lawsuits on glyphosate safety and Roundup, which is not safe, by the way. So what they found is there's a guy, Jess Rollins, that worked in the toxicology department at the EPA. He intercepts and finds out that another division within the regulatory system is going to do this peer-reviewed study. He intercepts it. He tells Monsanto that he's going to be able to stop this lawsuit. You know what I mean? Not lawsuit, but this scientific investigation, and he eventually does. And so when they came out with the review of glyphosate with Jess Rollins at the end of the Obama administration, they said it was perfectly safe. That the IARC, which had a year before said it caused cancer and was linked to cancer in humans and lab animals, they wiped that out. So today we have this magical theory that glyphosate is perfectly safe. But as I mentioned earlier, when you spray Roundup, you're not spraying just glyphosate. Only 41% of that product is glyphosate, and the other is adjuvants to make it pierce the wall of a plant and be harmful to it and to kill it. And we can get into the adjuvants, and I know you know a lot about that, so I'd be interested to hear what you have to say. But one of them is potalamine, which is pig fat, pig lard, and that helps. It basically helps break the plant structure down, so the glyphosate can penetrate the cells and seep down into the roots and eventually kill it. So in France, they sued Monsanto on potalamine, and they because they know that causes cancer specifically. And so Monsanto had to reformulate their products for France, but they didn't do it for the US. And the alarming fact is it's not just when you have a genetically engineered crops, these pesticides have failed on a massive level, starting around 2005, 2006. Weeds that were resistant to glyphosate started popping up in fields all over rural America, especially in the Midwest and in the South. They have I think pigweed or pomeranth was a big resistant to Roundup and glyphosate. And so now they have to put 2,4-D and dicamba resistance inside a corn or a soybean seed, which means we're getting carpet bombed with like Roundup and basically Agent Orange combination across rural America just to combat weeds, which I find pretty shocking. I'm from Iowa. I'm a 6th-generation Iowan. My family originally moved there and farmed for 3 generations. My family owns farms, and it's really, for me, it's heartbreaking, not just for the human health implications, but glyphosate, because it has 4 patents on it. One is a herbicide. One is for a chelator, where it chelates and binds essential minerals, like it will bind zinc, boron, and magnesium within the plant. It won't in the soil. It won't make it available to the soil, to the plant. So it will, and the way it works, it basically shuts down the plant's immune system. So we're eating nutritionally deficient plants when we eat those GMO corn and soy, but we're also eating they spray it on wheat, oats, and barley as a desiccant. But the bigger shock, besides human health, is the real problem is that it damages the soil and the soil microbiome. So just like if you're a human, you hurt your gut microbiome, you have gut dysbiosis. They're doing the same thing to the farmers' fields. And we're having massive soil loss and soil erosion because of that.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a bunch of good points. First of all, like I think a lot of these data scientists don't realize that a lot of the data is done in-house by the chemical company's scientists on their payroll and then sent to the FDA for review. And they never release this data. Unless there's like a, disgruntled employee leaked something or there's a lawsuit that required it. And then whenever the few times it was released, I mean, the data sucks. You would
Absolutely.
think
Yeah.
like if they're marketing the thing is so safe and wonderful and such a miracle herbicide, basically, why not release the data and prove
Yeah.
to these people speaking up against it that it's magnificent and safe? And a lot of these silly data driven influencers online, I don't think they have like zero farming experience. They're just moreover just looking at like pubmed.gov or things on paper
Sure.
and then kind of trying to connect the dots, but they don't understand the intricate details of the
Yeah.
politics that goes on under the table, which leads to the data they're reading. Because oftentimes, like they're they're like, oh, glyphosate is safe, and that's what's used in the farm. I'm like, dude, no one uses the active ingredient in farming.
Yeah.
Like, why do you keep mentioning that? Like, people use the complete formulation, and on top of that, many other complete formulations in a single growing
Yeah.
season, which oftentimes have a synergistic effect. So now instead of
Sure.
1+1 = 2, it's like 1+1 = like 500 or 1,000, you
Yeah.
know?
You listen, you're absolutely right. It is alarming, I think that and I think there's a lot of well-meaning people. And I'll just say, listen, I went to Dartmouth, it's a great school, a lot of really smart people, but even people that have Ivy League degrees do not understand the complexity of how our regulatory system works. I'll just say it's very interesting. I tried to talk to a friend of mine about this in 2016 at a reunion, and he was worked in the pharmaceutical industry. And he says, well, the agencies wouldn't approve it unless it was safe. And he said that because he said this because he knows, because he's trying to get, biotechnology products and other pharmaceutical products approved by the FDA. And I said, well, how do you get them approved? He says they have to pay the FDA in the regulatory process. I'm just saying it's a pay to play system. People don't know that. The FDA and the EPA, it is a pay to play system. And I'll just say, like, listen, the formulations of these products are very toxic, and it's not acknowledged. And people share information. I'll just say the interesting thing, you're talking about these influencers, just they're basically parrots. They basically accept the propaganda line that Monsanto and the scientists and the PR team from the biotech industry sends them. They don't do their own research. The USDA, the FDA, and the EPA, they do not conduct original research. Just like you said, they rely 100% on the regulatory process to be supplied science by that company to get that product approved. And there's so many examples of these major corporations fudging the science and lying about it. You can talk about tobacco, you can talk about Oxycontin. I mean, there's just dozens of examples here. And now we have GMOs and we have these pesticides, major pesticides in our food supply, and no one really knows about it. I'll just say, like, it's 20, like, I'm very hopeful. Like, I had health issues myself, so I had chronic health conditions. So I retired in 2018, kind of leading this charge on GMO labeling. And we published the first report on glyphosate food residues in November 2016, just right after the election. So I'll just say I made a lot of friends there. But most people don't know about this in their food. And the biggest thing, it's not just genetically engineered foods, but crop desiccation, spraying Roundup on top of oats, wheat, and barley, chickpeas, and lentils. And there's actually 70 other crops, grapes, and other crops that they spray Roundup on to dry them out right before they harvest them and send them. And this hadn't been done in the US until the early 2000s. And that's exactly coincides with a massive explosion of chronic health conditions, and also and there's a study, I have it, I think it's in the second report that we did. And let me bring up that name. What is
Mhm.
it? Okay, so it's called Glyphosate Contamination, the Poison in Our Daily Bread. What we did is, because we knew we were more, when we published this peer reviewed, it wasn't a peer reviewed study, I'm sorry, when we published this study, this food residue study in 2016, I had published more data on glyphosate food residues than the federal government. Do you know what I mean? Like, it cost me $50,000 to get I think at that time it was only 29 to 30 food products tested, get it tested, get the science reviewed, and get it published. And at that point, we had published, and we used an FDA certified lab that tested products imported from foreign countries, because we knew no matter what, what lab we used, they would try to go after it. We just randomly found this FDA approved lab in San Francisco that was willing to do these tests because all the scientists there were hearing about the harm of glyphosate themselves, and a lot of them had children, and so they were curious. Anyway, I'll just say the second test that we published, we actually knew there had been between 2016 and 2021, there had been about half a dozen other nonprofit organizations that had published this data. And so I used to run a group, Food Democracy Now. I started that in 2008 with a hog farmer friend of mine, Paul Willis, and Paul Willis helped start Nyman Ranch Pork, and he raised his hogs out on pasture. I used to always love going to his farm because it was like one of the few places in a 50-mile radius where you could actually see live hogs out on pasture raised like our grandparents had done. Today, they're in these massive factory farms. So I'll just say we published this study in 2016, and by 2021, half a dozen other groups had come out with some glyphosate reports. The problem was they weren't really, and I think one of the highest ones was it was supposed to be an organic hummus. So chickpeas. Hummus used to be one of my favorite foods, but they tested, it had 10,000 parts per billion, which is like off the charts. And they may have just gotten lucky to have gotten that product and have it, but we found that is an insanely high level of glyphosate residue in a chickpea container is very small. You usually eat it in a 2 or 3 day period. And I'm just saying, like, I could go through those in maybe like half an hour, one of those, but
Mm-hmm.
like you're getting a massive dose of glyphosate. So what it does is it kills your stomach bacteria. And when it kills your gut microbiome, that opens like I think they say like 70% of your immune system is in your gut, basically. That's where your immune system, and that's where a lot of your dopamine is actually made, is in your gut. So we tested 30, I'm looking at it right now. We tested 37 conventional foods. We tested 26 non-GMO food products, and we tested 23 organic foods because my health wasn't getting any better, even though I was eating 100% organic. And I'll just say, in the conventional, out of 37, 23 tested positive for glyphosate contamination. Of the 26 non-GMO foods, and some of those were non-GMO project verified, 18 of them. So
Mm-hmm.
roughly 70% of the non-GMO food products contained glyphosate, and 2 of the top 5 were non-GMO. So I recommend people eat an organic diet as much as they can. I realize that they cannot always do it, but if you have young children, never feed your children Cheerios. There's better organic alternatives. Like Nature's Path is a really good family-owned organic company. And so they definitely have a Cheerios alternative that children were like. And so when we test and the stores we tested were that had the highest levels, and one is a local store in Iowa. I think it's an employee-owned store, Hy-Vee. And so they had the highest level. It was a whole wheat bread. It was 1,150 parts per billion. Whole Foods had a whole wheat bread that was 1,040 parts per billion. So even if you go to Whole Foods and I mean, most people think Whole Foods is a health food store. It does have a lot of organic. It does have a lot of healthy products, but they also have some very toxic products in there.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not, most of them are organic. And so I'll just say, and ironically, Walmart came in number 3, not number 1, and their product was at 889 parts per billion. And Target, we thought Target would have, and we tested the same type of breads in each of these stores. We know whole wheat had it, and Target only had 348 parts per billion. So, but I'll just say it was shocking that we found out the non-GMO product verified had glyphosate in it, glyphosate residues.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to be very careful with what you eat. And that's why I say if you're going to eat whole wheat bread, if you're going to eat hummus, chickpeas, lentils, barley, oatmeal, make sure you're eating organic. If you don't, you're opening yourself up to like gut dysbiosis, disruption of your microbiome, which ultimately leads to something like IBS or leaky gut, and then SIBO. And if you have any, I don't know if you have any clients that have gut health issues,
Mhm.
but it can be very challenging to overcome that, especially with a modern food supply.
Yeah, one difficulty I had too trying to follow the safety studies of glyphosate is sometimes even when certain independent labs did try to measure the toxicity of the complete formulation altogether,
Yeah,
there are so many different versions of Roundup, and they
sure,
actually confuse every Roundup product as exactly the same, but every single one has a slightly different ratio of inactive to active ingredients, and then
sure.
also a completely different composition of, this stuff. But that's also another
No, that's
confusing
good
thing
you mentioned
because,
that. Just
yeah,
real quick, I hate to interrupt. I
no,
apologize.
no, take it. This is your show.
There's 700 different products formulated with glyphosate. So
Yeah,
like you say, it's not the same product. They create some in the US, China creates some, other countries if when they have a license from Monsanto. Now it's off patent. So I think it can be generic. And that's that's part of the reason they're probably sticking 2,4-D and dicamba, in the formulation, because that means they can go longer, and that they're sticking those resistance into the seeds, because then they can go on patent for another 20 years.
yeah, and I think that's why I'm kind of speculating that a lot of these kind of influencers are making data-free assumptions. Not
Yeah,
only do a lot of them not understand that glyphosate itself is not actually used in the field, so they don't even know its proper application. But then
yeah,
on top of that, I don't think they even know that there's so many hundreds of different variations of Roundup, and each
yeah,
one has a different toxicity range. So they're just making these like blanket, like very inaccurate, in my opinion, blanket statements, like totally not data driven whatsoever, because there's really no uh,
sure.
uh, federally kind of funded data on complete formulations altogether. And once again, with glyphosate, for example, I mean, the active ingredient in isolation is so weak, it can barely kill weeds. And it's still found to be toxic. So imagine what's going
Yeah,
on as a complete formulation.
sure. Well, listen, I know it may sound depressing to a lot of people that are just learning about this, but I'm very hopeful. It is, we have been the last 10 years, the last 9 years on the cutting edge of wakening people up to how toxic our food supply is, but also how citizen engagement in this process, in the democratic process, can change it. And that's my background. I grew up in a very political family. Um, I remember when I learned that the World Wrestling Federation was fake. I mean, as a kid, you think as a kid, like, oh my God, that's amazing how they jump off these ropes. But then you learn it's just theater. I mean, they're just they choreograph it beforehand, and so I got very interested in politics in the 70s as a kid. And when Crossfire came on, that became my new. I became a political junkie, and so things have significantly changed since the 70s and the 80s. I'll just say I think we really have had a massive corruption of our democracy by corporations. Corporate power controls our elected officials. It's no longer our elected officials telling what corporations what to do. It's no longer our elected officials, members of Congress, state capitals, governors, and the president. They accept corporate talking points. They accept corporate, millions of dollars in corp every year, millions in, like, I think this year 1.5 billion dollars will be spent, maybe $2 billion this time, on the presidential race, the race for the White House. When they're doing that, that's silencing the voice of the American public. But I'll just say I have seen significant improvement in awareness. And I think in 2018, the Congress actually had, remember, I think the Democrats controlled the House at the time. They actually had here, or maybe the Senate, they had hearings on glyphosate in Congress, which I was really reassured to hear. But right now, at the same time, there have been, I think, 10 thousands of lawsuits filed, up to 10,000, and billions. Monsanto has lost billions of dollars in legal court rulings that have proven that glyphosate does cause cancer in all these different people. And Dwayne Johnson was the famous example was Dwayne Johnson, who was a landscaper, not
Mhm.
really landscaper, but a groundskeeper for a school in California. He read that this thing is perfectly safe on the back of the label, and then the spray pack that he's wearing on his back leaks on his back, and it gets all over him, and eventually he develops these lesions. And I think he was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And fortunately, he stood up. I don't know if it was 2018. It's kind of hard to keep track of all these different
Hmm.
laws and all the different regulatory things. They ruled, I think he won $285 million settlement. That's what the jury ruled for him. And I was just reading about a recent one from last year where a jury in Missouri, they awarded the plaintiff $1.5 billion. Can you imagine that? Because the main chemical company in their state knowingly rigged the regulatory process and knowingly lied about the safety of their product for 30 years. So I want to have people understand this conversation, that there's reason to be hopeful. And I don't believe in like Chicken Little activism.
Hmm.
I don't believe in scaring people and making them change. We're trying to get information to empower people so they can make informed decisions and so they can be active members of our democracy. Because without that, I think without active citizen engagement, it's a very bleak future.
Well, what's your response? Like a lot of their responses are like, yes, Monsanto is, or Bayer now, whoever, owns it at
Yeah.
this point. Yes, they're being sued. Yes, they're losing a lot of cases, but it's to do with people that actually work in the fields with these chemicals. But the food that the average consumer eats is completely safe. That's a huge argument from that corner. What's your response to that?
Well, again, this is cigarette science. These people are just repeating talking points that have been sent to them by Monsanto's lobbyist and PR fraud department. So the fascinating thing about these lawsuits is they uncovered millions of pages, and thousands of these pages showed absolute fraudulent science. And I'll read this. One is from Donna Farmer. She had to testify under oath. She was Monsanto's lead toxicologist. And I just want to say I'm reading a direct quote from this lawsuit. I believe this was a Dwayne Johnson lawsuit. It says the terms glyphosate and Roundup cannot be used interchangeably, nor can you use Roundup for all the glyphosate-based herbicides anymore. For example, you cannot say that Roundup is not a carcinogen. This is Monsanto's top toxicologist testifying under, I think this might have been an email, but she also had to testify under oath, basically saying you cannot say Roundup is not a carcinogen. We have not done the necessary testing on the formulations to make that statement. The testing on the formulations are not anywhere near the level of the active ingredient.
Hmm.
So right there, that should send chills up your spine if you're a parent feeding your children Cheerios, or if you're an elected official. You have knowingly kind of sat by, if you're an elected official, you've knowingly sat on your hands while Monsanto has rigged the science. So this is exposed in a lawsuit, I think in 2017 or 2018. The next one is from Jess Rowlands, and he's the EPA deputy division director in the pesticides division. And he told the Monsanto lobbyist in an email, so that guy emails his fellow Monsanto executive seeking to kill a federal scientific review of glyphosate's carcinogenicity. And this is the one that I talked about 10 minutes earlier. Basically, this is what your EPA deputy division director of the pesticide division is telling Monsanto's lobbyist. If I can kill this, I should get a medal. You know what I mean? Like, how shocking is that? Like, they literally have a very legitimate scientific review of the science set up, and he's intervened on
Hmm.
behalf. And so he works with Monsanto's lobbyists behind the scenes, and they get to kill it in another division. They get it brought under him, and then well, they didn't show, they basically rigged that review of glyphosate to say that it was perfectly safe. And the sad thing about this testimony in this court is another scientist at the EPA had cancer herself, and she was resigning, and she specifically, and I think this became public in 2018, she sent an email to Jess saying, do not monkey around with the science and do not lie about it like you've been doing for so many years. So the truth comes out eventually. That's the sad thing. Is that, I mean, the good news is the truth comes out. Unfortunately, there's millions of people that are sick. And I was saying, listen, cancer is not the worst thing that you can get from a food product. We often think that, but cancer is often curable if it's caught early enough. There are scientific protocols, there are natural medicine protocols where you can heal from cancer. But what it can do, if you get a chronic illness like IBS or Crohn's or SIBO, other gut health issues, or respiratory infections, which glyphosate, it's not just in our food, it's not just on GMO crops, it's actually in the air.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning into the podcast. I'm curious, have you ever been confused by the labels in the grocery store? In Yevgeny's book, he demystifies the difference between caged, cage-free, free-range, and pasture-raised meats. He also covers how to avoid GMOs, source high-quality water, fish, supplements, and other related topics. It's a beautifully illustrated, non-technical read that comes with a comprehensive video series and other extended learning materials. Jump on Amazon and check out the book titled Anti-Factory Farm Shopping Guide by Eugene Trufkin. Now let's dive back into the podcast.
Yeah, I mean,
And the water.
yeah,
and the lakes,
air and water.
the soil.
Yeah, so it's one of the most, I think, a billion
Sorry to interrupt,
pounds.
Dave, but
No
it's
worries.
funny how Monsanto marketed for a long time. One of their biggest things is it doesn't stay in the environment. You know what I mean? That was one of their biggest selling points. It kind of deteriorates quickly. But then how is it found in all this food? How is it found in like 70% of rainwater samples and like pretty much every male's like semen, blood, and urine samples if it's not persistent?
No.
Sorry, go ahead. I get kind of fired up about these sometimes. Can't control myself.
And you absolutely, you should. Your whole job that you do is try to make your clients healthy. It's try to teach people how to be healthy and improve their health. And I'm just saying, when you have this thing in there, I would say I think glyphosate food residues is like the secondhand smoke in our food supply. And I think there's a chemical time bomb that is exploding right now. This is the sickest generation. Americans right now are the sickest they've ever been since our nation was founded in 1776.
Sorry, Dave, one more interruption. Not only the
ahead.
sickest they've ever been, Americans right now are mentally and physically the sickest humans in all of human history.
Yeah. No, it's stunning. I mean, the statistics better than I do. I think Robert Lustig is a doctor in California. I think he's got a book, Metabolical. I haven't read it, but I just saw the other day, 93% of adults in America have some type of metabolic disorder, meaning their metabolism and their health is not functioning properly. 60% of adults either are overweight or obese. A minimum of 20 to 25% of our children are obese. Like over 50% of adult Americans have one or two more chronic health conditions. This is alarming. It's shocking. The food industry is literally a $1 trillion industry. But they say the amount of harm that our food supply does, cheap calories, cheap food, processed, they call it ultra processed food today. It's junk food, it's garbage food. Basically, we're making this not only the sickest generation in American history, but like you said, in human history. And there's $1 trillion is what the revenue that our food supply agricultural products create. And it's matched by $1 trillion of healthcare responses to the poor quality of our food supply. So
yeah. And then kind of going back to one of your little statements of the revolving door of corruption of industry and government officials. But a lot of people don't know, but a lot of people, for example, from the FDA, once they finish their stint there, they actually go work for these private industries.
Yeah.
So they don't want to rock the boat because they make exponentially way more money working for these chemical industries. like Michael Taylor was the famous example you mentioned. So of course they don't want to kind of cut their connections, you know what I mean? So they
Yeah.
kind of look the other way, or shuffle the paperwork a little
Sure.
bit and kind of do some wizardry with the numbers, and it kind of all passes eventually and stuff
Mhm.
of this sort. So a lot of the people, these data influencers reading this data, they really don't know, like, the data they're reading is oftentimes just bogus.
No, absolutely. No, it's a very good point. Not only does Monsanto do the original research and then submit it to the agency, um, in the initial approval with glyphosate, in the 70s, they were not going to declare it 100% safe. They were going to declare that there was a possibility of cancer. However, I think it was Donald Rumsfeld that came in and rigged the system in Monsanto's favor in that example. I can't remember if it was the Nixon administration. And so they had a study that showed that there were increased amounts of renal tubular tumors in male mice in this one study. And then Monsanto came in and muddied the waters, and they submitted historical data. So historical data, when you're doing a peer-reviewed study, you don't need to look at historical data. You need to look at how the mice in that study responded. You add historical data to dilute the actual findings in that study. And so that's what they did. And in this initial approval with the EPA, actually two EPA scientists stated publicly that they did not agree with the toxicology department's lead on this. And they specifically made statements in those documents. So there is a paper trail of corruption of the scientific process within the EPA. There is a massive, now because of these lawsuits, there's a massive paper trail. And it's shocking, but right now, this year alone, Bayer has submitted legislation in 3 different states. One, I believe, is Idaho, one is Iowa, and the other one, I believe, is Missouri, to try to exempt chemical companies, for basically protect chemical companies, so that individuals that find that they have cancer or any harm can't sue that chemical company for harm. And I think there's legislation that's introduced. They want to do an amendment in the Farm Bill. So the shenanigans have not stopped, even after Bayer bought them. So Bayer, the interesting thing is Bayer bought them in 2018, and immediately these lawsuits start getting filed. So Monsanto knew their days were numbered after the 2015 IARC ruling. And we had built a huge movement. I think I was a co-chair of Prop 37 in California. That was in 2012. It was a ballot initiative to label GMO foods. And we woke up millions of people across America. No one knew much about Monsanto or GMOs up until that point. And the interesting thing, so I worked as a grassroots activist in Iowa. I moved back to Iowa in 2006. And during the 2007 Iowa caucus, which is Iowa prior to the 2024 election, Iowa used to be the first in the nation caucus. That meant we had all the presidential candidates come to Iowa first. And I got to know all these presidential campaign staff. I worked very closely with the Obama campaign team, and I actually convinced their environmental and ag lead that labeling GMOs was a good idea. So Obama said it at a speech at an event in November 2007 that I organized, and I had video cameras at that event. So I sat on that video for 4 years. I thought maybe when Obama first ran, he'd probably be vice president or a cabinet level official. He'd only been in the Senate at that time. But his campaign, their grassroots staff were so good. They were so much better than the Clinton campaign or the John Edwards campaign. They really engaged with every Iowa citizens to try to understand the policy concerns that Iowa farmers had, the policy concerns about the environment. So at that time, 2007, the factory farm issue was probably the leading political heated issue in rural America, in rural Iowa. The approval of factory farms, which started massively in 1995 and 1996, coinciding with the approval of GMO crops, that had festered for 10 years. and became the hot button issue of the 2006 governor's race. It had previously been a hot water issue. And so that we got Obama to not want to approve more factory farms. And the interesting thing is with my relationship with them, sometimes you get a phone call that changes your life. And I'll just say October 17th, 2007, I was sitting in the Iowa Sierra Club office and I get a call from the Obama campaign and they're going, and they go, "We need your help." And I'm just thinking like, wow, you really are desperate if you're calling me asking for my help. I said, "What's going on?" I said, "Well, we have Hillary walking into Montano's law firm in Washington, D.C. and they're having a fundraiser called Rural Americans for Hillary." And at that time, there apparently had been two news stories that had broken publicly. I didn't know about them at that time because I was too busy trying to call Iowa environmentalists to show up to caucus at an event. So anyway, because of that phone call, Obama's ag lead asked me, "What can we do here?" And I basically told him, I said, "Well, you're in trouble. You're a first-term Illinois senator. You can't criticize Monsanto." No one really knew who Monsanto was at the time anyway. "You can't criticize GMOs because it's the number one crop planted in Iowa. They're the number one crops planted in your state in Illinois." I said, "If you do, you'll get in a lot of trouble. However, you can ask for labeling." I go, "It's a common sense idea. Most people support it. Polling 75 to 90% of people ever polled support GMO labeling." And I said, "Well, by the way, so whose answer do you want? Do you want mine or do you want the Farmers Union? Because that's who I was working for at the time." He goes, "Well, I need both." And I said, I had the Iowa Farmers Union policy manual with me, and I flipped to the page and it said they supported labeling of genetically engineered foods. And so this is at a time where most of the farmers in Iowa, even the progressive farmers, I'm just saying, even progressive farmers that were asking for massive reform of our industrial food system, they planted GMO crops, but they still thought that it was a reasonable idea that American citizens should know what's in their food. So literally 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, Obama shows up at this event and promises to label GMOs. I released that video in 2011 in the lead up to 2012 because we wanted to build a political movement to educate people. And so from that video, from the Iowa caucus in 2007 to 2012 to the California ballot initiative to label genetically engineered foods, we woke up millions of people. And so we lost the 2012 ballot initiative, but it was a very interesting exercise in democracy. I think Monsanto spent $45 to $46 million to defeat us, and we raised roughly $8.6 million. So we were just a scrappy group of nonprofits. Organic Consumers Association was really big in that. Nature's Path was a major contributor. They really supported us, which I'm eternally grateful for. And a bunch of the small family-owned organic companies supported us. But we lost by less, I think it was 1.8 percentage points, even though we were outspent 5-1. So in American politics, money talks. So corporate money. The fascinating thing is the next year we had a ballot initiative in Washington State. And the next year after that, we had one in Oregon. And the one in Oregon, we lost, I think it was 437 votes or 830. So it was like, less than 1,000 votes that we lost. So in that process, by having these state ballot initiatives, by exposing Monsanto's corruption, that gave scientists all around the world finally the courage to wake up and do their own peer-reviewed science. So the famous study, and have you heard of Seralini?
Yeah, Seralini Labs. I actually tried my best to contact him to do a show, but it's tough to get a hold of that guy.
Well, I'd love to. You should definitely interview. He's an amazing human being. I'll just say this: very brave and very heroic. Another guy is Michael Antonio, who is the top people on his studies research. And so in 2012, in the middle of this ballot initiative, a study comes out. And if you can post photos of this rat study where female mice had massive mammary tumors on them, like you have these mice that are really skinny, and they have these, like, it's like ping pong balls stuck under their skin, these massive tumors hanging off them. And so what Ciarlini did, so technically, let's just talk about the scientific review process. Monsanto has so rigged the science that they've mastered how to show no harm in glyphosate. So what they do, the life cycle of a rat is roughly 2 years. So a 2-year rat is roughly 60 to 65 years old in human terms, just like a dog. Lovely 1 year for a dog is 7 human years, something like that, whatever that equation is. And so Monsanto submits safety studies, they're called safety studies, safety reviews, on glyphosate that are 90 to 120 days long, right? So Ciarlini said, that's really kind of bogus. That's not actually a proper cancer study. That's not even, that's maybe like a minor toxicological study. So 90 days is roughly 6 years for a rat, you know, and 120 days, probably 10 or 12 years. So when what Ciarlini did, he found that the harm from glyphosate testing showed up after 90 to 120 days. So that's when the animals started getting sick. So if Monsanto is submitting only studies that are 90 days long or 120 days long, they're leaving out the rest of the rat's life cycle. Humans are not exposed to toxic chemical in our food supply for just 6 years. One of the most habitual things that we do as humans is our diet. The food in America is made to be addictive. We wake up every day, we search out our favorite meal, whether, and today most people eat fast food. They'll either shop at McDonald's or go to Starbucks or go somewhere else. And these highly processed foods contain a lot of glyphosate residue. So 2 things. One, they rigged the science from the very beginning of this whole process. You know what I mean? And they found out that they could submit 90 day and 120 day studies. Ciarlini did a 2-year carcinogenic review. And so it showed the tumor is starting to show up at month 4. And and by 2 years, it was appalling the amount of rats that had tumors. And so the amazing thing is Michael Pollan had a copy of this study before it was published, as did other people. But the amazing thing was watching Monsanto and the biotech industry's public relations disaster crisis PR, just overnight, within 72 hours, they had quote unquote debunked the study, because they were claiming that, well, it's a Sprague Valley rat. That rat is actually designed to show cancer and designed to show tumors. Well, specifically, that's why they use that rat, because it's sensitive and it will show harm. Just like, like in any human population, there are certain populations genetically and through their diet and lifestyle experiences, epigenetics, that they're more sensitive, right, to certain cancer, certain carcinogenic exposures. So anyway, it's fascinating to watch this industry kind of bamboozle the press, threaten our elected officials. And I know half a dozen scientists who have come up to me and told me that they were either kicked out of a job because they were publishing it, they'd done a study, or that the head of their department said, you cannot publish any science. There was a woman that was about to get this article published. It was peer reviewed, and the head of her department at Iowa State canceled the publication. Said, we cannot do this. If we do this, we will not get funded anymore by Monsanto. And so the interesting thing, during the Iowa caucus in 2007, Obama promised to not only to label GMO foods, which wasn't widely known, but his main promise to Iowa farmers and farmers across the Midwest, which is why they supported them in big numbers, is that he promised to engage in dismantling massive monopoly power, monopoly control of our food supply. So meat packers and the beef industry is roughly four companies control 84% of the market. Pork industry, 65% of the market. Chicken industry, the same thing. And basic economic theory for 100 years has always stated that anytime industry has 4 companies that control 40% or more of a market, it's basically a rigged market. So previous economic theory and previously monopoly enforcement would have required those companies to either be broken up or to not engage in non-competitive practices. However, Robert Bork is a famous lawyer, and he helped design a legal theory that stated that basically changed the way monopoly laws were enforced. With Obama's promise to break up monopolies, he won a lot of farmer support. And the unfortunate thing is, Obama promised to do that, and they had these 5 hearings across rural America. I think it was 2010, and Food Democracy Now, we handed in 250,000 signatures in support of the Obama administration promising to break up these ag monopolies, but they refused to do it. They never, Attorney General Eric Holder and the people in his department never went through with it and never enforced it. So I know a lot of people will blame the USDA and Secretary Vilsack, Tom Vilsack, who's a former 2-term Iowa governor. But actually, the people that do the enforcement of antitrust are in the Department of Justice. So we've had a really broken regulatory system for a long time in rural America, which was what is a major reason why we've lost farmers for the last 50 years. And Monsanto is kind of the king of regulatory corruption. And they had I think at one point they had an 80% lock on GMO approved seeds. I think that's changed a little bit in the past few years, but that's how they gain market control. That's how they kind of buffalo farmers to use their crops and lock them in. They've actually gone to banks and they've advised banks not to loan to farmers that plant non-GMO organic seeds, because they say in the actuary table that those crops are more risky compared to their seeds. So
Yeah, and I think a lot of times, even if it is legitimate research, which most of the time in this topic it's not, just because it hasn't been scientifically quote unquote proven yet doesn't mean it's not true.
yeah,
I think there's a lot of confusion there
sure.
because sometimes it takes like 10, 15, 20 years to finally kick in and start seeing the real side effects of these chemicals. And then on top of that, it's just like, first of all, these are again super data-free assumptions because no one is exposed to just one active ingredient in isolation on its own. In fact, I read a report from Environmental Working Group, their annual report, I think in 2019. They had different laboratories set up on different continents, and they tested like the average newborn born in a metropolitan area was born with already 233 different industrial chemicals in their blood.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say, Environmental Working Group is an interesting organization. Ken Cook, I don't necessarily trust him. I don't trust that organization. We had ballot initiatives, GMO labeling ballot initiatives for 3 years. They never gave a dime. They never donated to these ballot initiatives. Ken Cook has been in power for 30 years in Washington, D.C. He should have published glyphosate residue studies in 2012, 2014, and 2016. I basically ran a nonprofit. We had 3 staff, myself, another woman, my partner at the time, and someone else, basically ran the organization. We had a very small budget, under $1 million. Never had a budget over $1 million. We published these studies. We conducted these studies, $50,000, because Iowa is the state that has the leading cancer rates in the Midwest, and it's the only state where cancer rates are rising. And just saying, Ken Cook's supposed to be some environmental hero. He should have published these studies in 2014 if they really care about it. They do interesting work on, like you said, on the studying the chemicals from other people around the world, but they're not friends of rural America. That's all I'll say.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. Well, I have 2 other studies that show
Sure.
a cocktail of chemicals in most people in the US.
Absolutely.
So I'm just going to do the PubMed ID here and people could look it up. 1634, 3651. And there's another study, 1842, 03, 31. Okay, so they can check out both of those and very large sample pools from all across America. And they show that even in, urine, blood, and semen samples, you find like a myriad of different chemicals like
Sure.
across America. So point being is no one tests, the cocktail of these chemicals and how all of them interacting and brewing in your body and body fat tissue, mostly 24/7, what that
Yeah.
leads to. So again, it goes back to all these data-free assumptions, all
Sure.
stemming from just testing the active ingredient in isolation on its own, and then kind of just filling in the gaps with some assumptions that presuming like it's going to be safe in some way, and then also just
Yeah.
ignoring the fact that um, no one just uses a single complete formulation in a farming cycle, especially in industrial operations.
Yeah.
And people eat a myriad of different foods, each
Yeah.
food being exposed to a myriad of different complete formulations during the production cycle.
Absolutely. Yeah. Listen, I would say glyphosate is not the only chemical out there that we need to be concerned about. I think there are dozens of chemical assaults on the human body and on children in America, especially. We have a corrupt regulatory system. We have a corrupt scientific system. Money buys power in America more. Like, we like to think that we're land of the free, home of the brave. We're one of the most corrupted regulatory systems on the planet. We actually corrupt other countries. Our lobbyists and our corporate executives go around the world and tell and bully and harass and threaten other scientists. There's a scientist, Carrasco. I can't remember. He was in Brazil, South America, where they attacked him and he was physically beaten. Do you know what I mean?
Hmm.
So I'm just saying, because the bullies of the chemical industry could not take it, he was exposing massive chemical harm, massive cancers, massive explosions of disease among children in South America. And the chemical industry, the biotech industry lost their mind. And they actually, in those countries, they'll go out and physically threaten you. I've been warned for my own physical safety because I fought Montano from Iowa. I'm just telling you, that does not make you a popular person when you're willing to stand up and tell the truth in a state where their entire economy is run
Mm-hmm.
on agriculture. Genetically modified foods are 30 million acres. I think of the 30 million acres of farmland in Iowa, 23 million acres are genetically engineered corn or soybeans. So I was warned by Monsanto's competitor about the work that I was doing in 2011. I interviewed Don Huber. You know Don Huber.
But
He's
for some reason sounds really familiar, but I can't put a
So
face to
Don
it.
Huber is a legend. He's a plant pathologist. He was one of the first scientists that actually stood up and had the courage and the cojones to stand up in 2011. So I think it was in January 2011, the Obama administration approved GMO alfalfa. GMO alfalfa is the main forage crop for dairy cows, for livestock. Most people don't know, humans don't eat alfalfa, but livestock do. And so Don Huber said this was a nightmare because if you do this, and Don Huber's background, he was a former plant pathologist. He taught at Purdue University for 40 years. Purdue University is the leading land grant. Well, it's the leading land grant university in Indiana. It's like Iowa State. Every state has a land grant university. He taught there for 40 years. He also worked at Fort Detrick. So he was a colonel in the U.S. military. And he literally was a scientist at Fort Detrick. And most people don't know what Fort Detrick is, but it's the biological weapons lab of the United States. So the top scientists in the US, in the US military, work at Fort Detrick and they study biological threats to human health and human safety. And Don Huber's background is when AIDS was first came about under the Reagan administration. C. Everett Koop, I think he was a surgeon general at that time, he had no idea what to do. So he called three top scientists from Fort Detrick to come help him study this and find out its origins, find out its modes of action, and find out if it could be stopped. Don Huber was one of the three scientists in America that C. Everett Koop called to find out its origins. And so when I met Don Huber 1 month after the Obama administration approved GMO alfalfa. The fascinating thing is it was at a conventional farmers, it was the conventional farmers convention, basically. These crop consultants came in, top crop consultants in the Midwest from all around the country were there. There were 500 commodity farmers. I'm sitting at a table of 10 people. They grow GMO crops. They own factory hog buildings, or the chicken. I was the number one hog grower in the United States. We're also the number one egg layer state. So massive amounts of factory farms. And Don Huber is standing up at the front of the podium saying, I just sent a letter to Secretary Vilsack explaining to them that there's a new plant pathogen that's been found linked to GMO soybeans and GMO corn. What we're having is massive livestock infertility in these factory farms and in these, with hogs. So the problem was the fertility rate in hogs was declining. And so you may not know this, most people don't know this, but they use artificial insemination oftentimes to impregnate hogs and to impregnate cattle, dairy cattle. And so what they were finding is there was an inability for these hogs to get pregnant. They were getting much sicker, and they were having cancer, and they were dying. And so most hog factory farms or chicken factory farms, they have a massive amount of antibiotics that are distributed within the feed. So Don Huber had been working with a group of scientists, a team of 5 or 6 scientists, and they initially found harm on a Kentucky horse farm where these are very expensive animals. They're owned by very wealthy people, and they could not impregnate these horses and get that to hold. And when they changed the feed from sprayed with Roundup to organic hay, the infertility issues went away. So Don Huber is saying this problem, and that would be like standing up in the middle of a evangelical or Catholic church and saying, the Pope isn't Catholic, or, or challenging Christian dogma. These farmers were not mad. They were shaking their head like, yeah, this is the problem we're having. This is exactly the problem we're having on our farm. And they wanted to know how to solve it. Don Huber recommended that they stop using GMO feed, and they do not use GMO alfalfa. The problem was, if they use GMO alfalfa, that would mean there would be a massive infertility rate within those animals, because that GMO alfalfa would now be spread with glyphosate. The fascinating thing is, either a year or two before that, Roger Beachy is a former Monsanto executive. He had testified in front of Congress that mysteriously we're finding massive amounts of infertility in our livestock, and we don't know why. 12 months, 18 months later, Don Huber releases this letter, and it sent shockwaves around the world. I actually interviewed him and released an interview, I think it was in June of 2011. We were supposed to release it the day that Osama bin Laden was shot. But literally the night before I'm supposed to release the study, the Navy SEALs killed Osama bin Laden. So we delayed it for about 3 weeks, and it kind of changed the headlines on it. But it was interesting. So Don Huber is one of these scientists that showed and stood up very early on, saying that not only does it link to cancer, it's linked to infertility. Glyphosate and Roundup are linked to massive amounts of infertility. Like you said, they recently found glyphosate in sperm. And that was a French study at a fertility clinic. So most of those people were infertile, having problems getting pregnant, and they were looking for what was causing it. It just so happens that it turns out to be glyphosate. The interesting thing is, I was on LinkedIn, a friend of mine who's a farmer in Minnesota, he publishes that study on his LinkedIn. And within an hour or two, he has a scientist from Bayer trying to discredit him. He has all these fake science communicators, they call influencers. So just saying, they're on his page trying to discredit the study. And there's a guy, Kevin Folta, who's a scientist in University of Florida. He was a former head of the horticulture department, but he eventually got removed from that because he was one of these fake science communicators that was pretending he was 100% independent, had nothing to do with Monsanto. But it was the reality is, Monsanto, they did, because he was a public university professor, they could do a Freedom of Information Act request, a FOIA request. They got all his emails and they found he was in constant contact with Monsanto's top lobbyists, Monsanto's top scientists, and they were feeding him exactly the talking points, the cigarette science that he used to go create this fake pattern of safety with their other American academics. So this is happening today in real time right now, where Bayer knows that their product causes harm. Monsanto scientists hid this harm for 30 years. Bayer can no longer like wash their hands. They're actively and knowingly selling a product that not only causes cancer, that's linked to infertility, that causes massive endocrine disruption. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on endocrine disruption. What happens when a person's hormones are out of whack?
Well,
They,
their health goes out of whack. That's
yeah,
yeah, go ahead. But that's another topic I wanted to touch on too, because a lot of these influencers are like, the dose makes the poison, which
sure.
is the standard model of toxicology that was first of all started in the
Yeah,
1600s. Chemicals have changed a lot since then,
yeah,
and a lot of them don't, I don't even think they even know that a lot of like 600 chemicals, at least to my knowledge, on the market
sure.
today actually have a non-monotonic dose response. That means the
Yeah,
lower the dose it goes, the more toxic it becomes.
sure.
And they're like always like they're stuck on this monotonic dose response from like the 1600s. I'm like, dude, you got to learn like basic toxicology before you make these videos.
Yeah, I mean, listen, they're using Stone Age science. I mean, like, listen, like the dose makes the poison. Like that was something that maybe the Greeks believed. That was
That
something
was it was started by some guy in the 1600s. I
the
forget his
ancient
name. I
Greek.
think it's started. Yeah, no. Go ahead.
No, anyway, so it's before pre-industrial revolution understanding of chemical interactions with humans, and they didn't like so to say the science behind the human microbiome is only 10 to 20 years old. Our deep understanding of a main component of our own system is only 20 years old. Endocrine disrupting science is a 30-year-old. You know what I'm saying? It's a relatively new 30 to 40 years old. So all these things have changed significantly since they approved this product in 19 and they did the initial safety test, fake safety test in the 60s, in the early 70s. So they're basically trying to pin us down at a time when the fax machine had barely been invented. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I'm not
I
saying,
want.
you know, you kind of got to cut a break to some of these people. I would say that most of them would want to know the science if it was actually presented to them properly. I would say our side sometimes improperly or irresponsibly presents the science. I don't like to fearmonger. I like to state very accurate science. I have done 2 reports, tested over 110 food products. I have over 210 footnotes in those studies because I believe this is a really important debate in our society. Corrupting science is just as bad as corrupting democracy. You know,
Yeah,
and I think our side has to be 100% accurate when we speak about it. But it is frustrating to watch these, like, we've almost reached peak idiocracy
hmm
within our scientific community, that they
and
can respond to this.
yeah.
And it's alarming because they have backgrounds in science. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, that's their whole marketing thing. It's like I'm right because I read the data. But I'm like,
sure.
dude, like
Listen, some of the smartest people I know don't have a PhD. Some of the
yeah.
smartest people I know never went to college. Having a degree in today's age means that you have been funneled into a very limited stream of knowledge. You no longer have cross-departmental, cross knowledge. I'm just saying, like, we have over specialization within science, and that doesn't allow for, I don't think, for broader thinking. Kind of, it narrows you down into a silo, and then that it's easier to control. I think the Rockefeller, very famous studies have been done about how the original Rockefellers in the early 1900s rigged the medical system, allopathic medicine against holistic medicine. that kind of thing. And like you were saying, smaller doses can be way more harmful than higher doses.
Yeah.
Ironically.
Well, oh, man, I kind of lost my thought of what I wanted to mention on the next one to build off what you said. Uh, Damn,
Well,
I hate when
let
that
me read
happens.
this. Let me read it. There's this one other quote I wanted to read. It's a
Yeah.
part of the first study that we put out in 2016, November 2016. And it's a quote on the second page, just under Jess Rowland's famous quote, who says, "If I can kill this, I should get a medal." And above that is Monsanto's top toxicologist saying, for example, you cannot say that Roundup is not a carcinogen. We have not done the necessary testing on the formulation to make that statement. I mean, that quote, those two quotes are alarming. That is like bone-chilling, stunning emissions from a top corporate scientist to a top regulatory scientist admitting that they're lying about the safety of this product. So you're like exactly what you said, but here's what I want to get down to. A 2001 study found that men exposed to glyphosate at work were between 20 to 26 more likely to develop non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. In fact, workers who came into contact with Roundup for 2 or more days every year were 212% more likely to get lymphoma than people with fewer than 2 days of exposure. So if you're a pesticide applicator, I've done landscaping. I did landscaping once for like 4 months. I enjoyed it, but fortunately I didn't have to use chemicals. But I'm just saying these people are exposed. Literally 2 days of exposure increases your likelihood to get non-Hodgkin's lymphoma by 212%. So it's not just people that are exposed to glyphosate as pesticide applicators or farmers anymore. It's in our food, it's in our rainwater, and it's in our drinking water in some cases. So in the United States, we're allowed, I think the US EPA has said that the safety limit is 700 parts per billion. So 700 parts per billion definitely can cause endocrine disruption, can definitely cause massive amounts of disruption to your gut microbiome. And I want to read this. I have these statistics up. Glyphosate and Roundup damage by the numbers. So these fake science communicators, fake influencers online, so they can claim that Roundup doesn't cause cancer all they want. But today we have dozens of studies directly linking glyphosate and Roundup to cancer. 2018, University of Washington found that glyphosate by itself had a 41% increase of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So I'm just saying there are more peer-reviewed studies. They'll never look at that study, or if they do, they'll debunk it. They'll try to debunk it. So Roundup and glyphosate damage by the numbers: 0.1 parts per billion Roundup and 0.05 parts per billion glyphosate altered the gene function of over 4,000 genes in the livers and kidneys of rats. So what is it? Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is exploding. 20% of people in England have that, adults. I'm just saying it's the shocking rise in that. Those are your body's detoxing organs, your kidneys and your liver. 0.1 parts per billion and 0.05 parts per billion of glyphosate show severe organ damage in rats. 0.1% permitted level for glyphosate and all other herbicides are in EU topwater. Anyway, so at 10 parts per billion, they found toxic effects on the livers of fish. And so these are studies that were done a decade ago. In the last 5 years, there have been half a dozen. The Ramazzini Institute is a very famous science institute in Italy who's done cancer studies for 4 decades, 5 decades, one of the leading cancer research agencies in Europe. They've done I think 6 studies in the last 8 years, and they've done it. They've proven that it's linked to cancer. They've proven it that it's an endocrine disruptor at a very low level. They've proven it that it disrupts the gut microbiome. I think 2017, 2018, there's a peer-reviewed study that shows that it disrupts the microbiome of bees. And it makes bees confused, and they can no longer find their way back to their hive. So it's saying this chemical is a massive assault on the web of life. So there have been studies about the what they call it, the insect apocalypse in Europe. And the Europe uses way less chemicals than we do, than American agriculture or landscaping business. So I was a kid. I was born in 1968. I remember lightning bugs as a kid in the 1970s. By the 80s, they disappeared. And by the 90s, I barely ever saw a lightning bug in the Midwest. The only time I saw a lightning bug, I think, was when I was in college in New Hampshire. So it's very shocking. And there's massive death loss of honeybees. And I'm sure you know how honeybees are transported all over the country.
Yeah,
They're
they help pollinate and basically keep our keep Mother Earth alive for the most part. And that's like one issue with a lot of like health professionals or influencers. They're like so myopic. They don't understand like you have to take care of the earth in order to be healthy too.
Sure.
They can't look holistically at that. And I think one of the issues is just a lot of them have like zero farming experience. Again,
Oh
they're
yeah,
just reading stuff off a laptop
sure.
that came from industry science that doesn't, for the most part, release any of their safety studies anyways. And then on top of that, on their even formulations on the back of the label, they don't even list the majority of the formulation because it's company secret. It's
Yeah.
like even hard to find like what the inactive ingredients in most formulations are. It's like
Sure.
you got to be Inspector Gadget just to discover this. And one thing I did forget that touched on it is a lot of these influencers are actually paid,
Paid
to
influencers, yeah.
their like Washington Post released a study. A processed food company was paying various popular registered dietitians online
Oh
to
yeah,
promote their junk. And like Anthony Caffey, MD, did a good
absolutely.
report on Dr. Ids being actually paid by the American Beverage Association, although he's like a doctor of promoting health. I just don't
Sure.
understand like how you can have the ethics of taking money from a company that clearly knows that a lot of people don't have education in nutrition, and a lot of people can't control themselves either, but yet release a product into the
Sure.
market that's clearly and obviously causing severe obesity and health problems in most people. Like,
Yeah.
how could you be like a doctor or a health professional and take money from such a company? I just don't understand the ethics there. I'm speculating. And then in
Well,
terms of,
I'm just saying someone likes their Porsche convertible or something. I don't understand it. And listen, our elected officials, there are a lot of good elected officials in the United States, but I'll say at leadership level, you do not get to leadership unless you are willing to accept the pay to play system. And the ironic thing, I think it was 2013 or 2014, I was in Washington, D.C. I was in a green room, and I was about Tom Hartman. I was about to be on his show, and we were talking about GMO labeling and genetically engineered foods and pesticides and glyphosate. And I'm sitting there, and there's like three or four other people in the room. There's a guy in a suit, and he's obviously very sophisticated. He asked me what I do. I tell him, we talk. He's a top lobbyist in New York State, New York City. I can't remember what he's being interviewed. I said, well, we're trying to pass a bill in the New York State Assembly, and he laughed, and we're on labeling genetically engineered foods. And he laughs at me and he goes, well, you better get ready to hand a suitcase full of cash to Shelley Silver, who was a Speaker of the House, Speaker of the Assembly in New York State. It turns out a few years later, Shelley Silver and his son were arrested for some type of basically accepting fraudulent donations or fraudulent money under the table by the New York State Attorney General's office. So this happens all the time. I don't understand it. I don't have children, but my sister and my brother do. And children are our future. They are starting out today sicker than ever. Autoimmune diseases. I was just talking to a good friend of mine. And she said her children are so scared for their future, they don't want to have children. Her daughter is a swimmer, she's got an academic scholarship, but she's also a swimmer. She has gut health issues, and she was really depressed this year. So I'm just saying, like, there's so many smart, intelligent kids, whose health is being harmed. I remember the first person I met with a peanut allergy when I was 16 years old. I was like, oh my God, peanut allergy. You're kidding me. Today, 20, you can't even bring peanut butter into some schools. You can't even open a peanut on an airplane, a peanut package. Do you know what I mean? The people are that sensitive. So I'm not sure what it is that makes people so intellectually incurious about the safety of some of these products. But for me, it's like I was diagnosed. I was diagnosed with leukemia when I was a kid, probably
Hmm.
10 or 11 years old. What happened was I was playing in the rivers and streams in southern Minnesota in farm country. In the spring, we would go out and run around there like Huckleberry Finn, and we would just go out and play in the rivers and streams. And in the summer, we would go to golf courses and we would get in their ponds and we would get free golf balls. We thought that was a great thing. So in the summer, all my lymph nodes swelled up all around my neck and under my arms and my groin, everywhere. And so my parents took me to a doctor. Says, yeah, we think he probably has leukemia. My dad had a friend who saw him at a Rotary meeting. His daughter had died of leukemia 2 years earlier. And my dad, well, what did you do? He said, we followed all the doctor's advice. We put her on chemotherapy. And the amazing thing is my dad said, I will not have chemotherapy. So he took me to a group of alternative doctors at that point in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. I also, saw a chiropractor. It was put on a supplement. I didn't go outside the house that summer for 6 weeks. So you can imagine being a kid cooped up in a house. But I'll just say both my grandparents on my mom's side died of cancer. My favorite uncle on my mom's side died of cancer in his early 50s. So I'm just saying cancer is very rampant in our society. And it's something that I've been highly attuned to since I was a kid. I will just say cancer is not a diagnosis, but that you can reverse cancer. You can heal people with alternative herbs, alternative medicine. Fasting is a great way. Getting rid of sugar, getting rid of seed oils is an amazing way. Food is medicine. We have somehow magically accepted this chemical food industry, this pesticide food industry, this toxic, ultra processed food industry as the normal thing to do. But it's less than 40 years old. When you really look at what we're eating on our shelves, most of it was never seen on a grocery store 40 years ago. I think I read a statistic recently that today we have 60,000 food products on the shelf, 2024. That statistic's been around since early 2000s. In the 1950s, it was only 600 food products in your average grocery store. So, this is a very modern disease creation through our food system. But I also, listen, I've spent the last 6 years working on soil health and regenerative agriculture. I'm very hopeful for the future of agriculture. I'm very hopeful for the, future of human health. But it's not going to happen if we have science communicators not doing a deep dive. And the other thing you said earlier, you talked about trade secrets. That's absolutely 100% that is anti-science. Having trade secrets on any scientific product that's sold to the American public and that they're consuming is an outrage. That is unscientific by its very nature. If you do not show your work in the scientific community, you are not doing proper science. If you know what I mean? So that's just the foundation of science is transparency. The foundation of science is showing other scientists your work. And so for 40 years, Monsanto got away with it.
Yeah. Well, one thing I always like to say is sick people can't make healthy decisions. And I do notice a lot of these kind of data-driven
Yeah.
influencers are kind of quite sickly looking and unhealthy themselves. So it
Sure.
totally makes sense,
Yeah.
I mean, they can't think in a healthy way, which is why they
Yeah.
look and not look that great or look terrible, in my opinion, some of them. And that's that. So
Never take health advice from a doctor who's 60 to 100 pounds overweight. And because that's a funny thing. All these doctors are saying today that they don't teach nutrition in medical school. They don't teach about food. For me, food is medicine. Food can heal.
a lot of these influencers do always constantly say food isn't medicine.
Well, of course.
I know it's stupid, yeah, but
Sure.
I guess like my one dream, and I thank you for being on the path too, is just for Americans to wake up and just stop normalizing like all these chemicals, these massive medical drug dependence and addictions to symptom management, healthcare practices that don't even work the majority of the time. Just wake up and see the reality of the situation. 9 out of 10 Americans are like metabolically sick right now. And literally, Americans are like more medically drugged out than ever before. But yet, like I mentioned, the sickest humans in the history of the entire human race. That includes a lot of these sickly researchers and data-driven bogus influencers that don't even know how to read data.
Yeah, listen, I mean, I want to mention psychiatric medicines, SSRIs. That's another fraudulent area of medicine. It's a fraudulent area of science. They just, and Alzheimer's research, they constantly rig science to fit a very narrow product development theory of corporate science. And that I think is, science is, I think science is like the pursuit of religion, the pursuit of spirituality. It's like the pursuit of art. It's supposed to be about the pursuit of truth, but it's been bastardized in our democracy. And I truly believe food is medicine. They can say whatever they want. Where do pharmaceutical companies go to find the compounds that they use, that they patent? They often go to rainforests. They often go to plant compounds. And that's one of the things that the Rockefeller, God, I can't remember what the medical commission did, but they basically, and they wanted to switch all the herbal and plant medicines that we had, that our ancestors had previously used 100 years ago, 150 years ago. We did not have pharmaceutically derived medicines. Now, some of these medicines do very miraculous things to heal people, but a lot of them just mask the symptoms, as you know.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest thing is our food supply is great. Like you said, unhealthy people can't make healthy decisions. So, our food supply has created a massive explosion, not just in diabetes, not just in obesity and diabetes, not just in cancer, not just in endocrine disruption and infertility. It's created a massive explosion in anxiety, a massive explosion in depression. Like when you're overloading your body with sugar and carbs on a daily basis, year after year after year, that suppresses your basic hormone, your body's hormones. So you, like you said, you cannot think clearly. So, I mean, listen, food is medicine. They need to get used to it because that's the future. I think that's really where we're heading. There's a lot of great doctors out there that are talking about this.
Sure.
Dr. Mark Hyman, Dr. Robert Lustig, Dr. William Davis, or Will Davis, the guy that does what is it, Wheat Belly?
I have that book. I never read it though.
Yeah, and he's got a new book out, which is really great. And I just would say I like to give people hope, and I like to give them things to go. I think it's called Super Gut. Have you heard of that one?
That one sounds new. I've never heard of it.
I
I'm
think
trying to think of this one doctor I wanted to give a shout out to, but for some reason I'm spacing out on his name. He really talks about the soil food web and its connection to how healthy people are, because I mean, obviously, as you're spraying all this junk, all these chemicals on the ground where the crops are being grown, it's killing and destroying the soil food web. Usually just kind of dramatically alters the ratio of bacteria to fungi, which basically destroys the balance of the soil food web. And then obviously, unhealthy soil, you're going to get unhealthy plants, and then nature's way of getting rid of unhealthy plants, send in the pests.
Yeah.
And then you need more chemicals and more medical drugs and more chemicals. And that's how we are today. Sad to say, talking about this freaking topic in 2024 should just be common sense stupid. I think in like 20, 30 years, people will look back at all these kind of like influencers and the way we industrialized food and just see how stupid it really was.
Sure. Listen, I agree with you 100%. We are definitely heading into a massive paradigm shift. So super gut, we've both mentioned the disruption of the gut microbiome, the disruption of the soil microbiome. So William Davis is a medical doctor. He came out with a book, I think, what is it? The grain. Anyway, he's got a new book out. It's called Super Gut. So if you have someone or you know someone that has, so his first book was, I'm sorry, Wheat Belly, but if you have someone in your life or you yourself have IBS or SIBO or Crohn's disease or celiac disease or any level of disruption of your hormones, get this book today. It's called Super Gut. It talks about the massive disruption of the human gut microbiome. I'm so amazed that like 10 years, less than 8 years after we released this glyphosate residue report, 2016, barely anyone was talking about glyphosate as a gut microbiome disruptor. He published this book, I think in 2022, about and he mentions glyphosate in there. So this is becoming widely known. And if you're someone who's sick, who has an autoimmune disease, if you have a family member, this is one of those books. And listen, I don't know the guy, I've never talked to him. I am plugging his book, and I would recommend it to everyone I know. I mean, I'm serious. Like, this is the type of book that will change your life if you read it and then you implement these health strategies. He has recipes in there to make your own yogurt at home. I'm not quite that far, but that's those are the next steps that I'm ready to try to implement in my own life.
Got it. Well, Dave, I really highly appreciate you coming on the show. And I think if we just kind of continue the conversation at this point, it's like beating the nail too hard or too
Sure.
many times, and I hopefully, for a lot of people, it'll probably go over their head, but for the few people that it influenced them, I mean, just the information is there. And
Yeah.
yeah, I really highly appreciate, you doing the hard work to kind of make the journey easier for people like me too, like laying the road ahead. And again, I'm
Likewise.
just
Yeah.
hoping you keep the journey alive too, and many people like you. I just again wish that Americans would just stop normalizing mental and physical pathology and making it a normal
Sure.
part of their life. And that is gonna have to be with just saying like, hey, all these chemicals and medical drugs left and right is just not working,
Yeah.
and not helping uh, anyone on the planet except make like a few people rich. And then when those people sell their stocks, they bail. And now the whole cleanup is the responsibility of the taxpayer and the community. And they're
Sure.
living a good life, pesticide free on some tropical island. So it's like, dude, come on, guys, let's wake up and see the stupidity in all this and kind of uh, just make the change. If you don't want to get into
Sure.
politics, that's fine. But start with just where your money goes. Stop funding all these idiotic companies and silly sickly influencers that
Yeah.
are just retarded. I don't know.
Well, listen, I get it. It's very frustrating. And I would just say, pay attention to your critics, but don't let them get under your skin. It's important that they're out there. I think because it shows how corrupt the industry is, that this thing is still out there. I want to ask you really quickly, because you said you worked with Jason Rowntree, from my background, he's a famous and legendary scientist in the agricultural space, in regenerative agriculture space. Have you seen there's a new documentary, Roots So Deep. It just came out. He's actually in there really briefly, but it's all about regenerative agriculture and how AMP grazing, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, can actually help increase soil organic matter, increase soil microbial activity. As you increase soil organic matter and increase soil microbial activity, you reduce synthetic inputs, especially fertilizers. You are basically you're saving the farmer not a ton of money. You're making the natural nutrients in that soil bioavailable to the plants and then the animals and then us ultimately. But incredibly, right now we're having, and where are you located again?
Planet Earth.
Planet. Okay.
San
Anyway, so
Antonio.
you're in a bunker.
Dave, please continue to talk. I just got to plug my phone in really quick, okay?
Okay.
To
No
make
worries.
sure it charges.
Sure. Last thing. So we're having massive floods in the Midwest, in Iowa and Minnesota, South Dakota, and in these states, and it's because we've broken the hydrological or the water cycles of these soils with chemical inputs. And I know that this doctor so the scientist that Jason Rowntree, has been a part of that. So I just love to hear. You mentioned that you knew him, and I just love to hear more about his work, because that is the future. Food is medicine, and regenerative agriculture is the future. And we need to celebrate these scientists that are doing the right thing.
Okay. I can kind of barely hear you, but I think that's my end. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, Jason is a great guy, very humble guy. I actually did like a research topic with him. I think it's been, I don't know, maybe a half a year ago already, or 8 months ago.
Wow.
But I'll let him describe it. But he's actually like a really great guy, and I really like him. Very humble
Sure.
too.
Yeah,
And I actually consider him as one of my mentors, and he kind of really helped fast
that's
track a
great.
lot of my knowledge of that industry as well.
Sure.
So
Well, I can't wait to read your research, what your research project was on. Um, I'll just say, listen, I always like to leave people with hope. I know this is very challenging when you have significant health issues or when your family does. But there is a lot of answers out there. Organic, biodynamic, and regenerative agriculture are key things that I think the American public are waking up to. Um, and definitely make sure that you focus on, if you have any type of health issue, focusing on your gut health and your microbiome is one of the fastest ways to turn it around.
yeah, and guys, instead of it kind of sound like I'm complaining a lot and not giving any reasonable answers, so some quick websites for you guys if you're interested in sourcing better quality food: AmericanGrassFed.org, EatWild.com, ForceOfNature.com is a great resource as well.
Yeah.
Happy-hens.com. That's great. They kind of sell locally in the Orange County area, but at least you have a great resource for what a soy and corn-free, like real pasture-raised operation for egg-laying hens looks like, so you can find something similar in your area of that sorts. Eating on the Wild Side by I forgot her name. It's been so many years since I read it. Is an amazing book as well. And then if you guys have any questions, just happy to reach out. Dave has been on a bunch of podcasts. I've been on a bunch of podcasts too. And I literally, in terms of this topic, I give away all the information for free. So if you're interested in really improving the sourcing of your food, like even if you buy my book, I'm basically selling it at cost. I really just want people to have this information. And again, on my dying bed, if I see Americans start, stop normalizing this life of mental and physical illness and medical drug dependence and chemical dependence, that would really be happy. I would say life complete, dude. And that's it. It's gotten a little bit better, at least than when I first arrived here,
Well, listen, thank you. You're doing a lot of great work. I've watched quite a few of your podcasts. I really appreciate you working with people, trying to get them healthy, getting this information out there. We really need a revolution in how we look at human health in America. We are headed in the wrong direction in many ways, but I do think there are many kind of annoying science influencers out there, or misinformation experts. There are a lot of people.
I like that, misinformation experts. I never heard that
Odd.
before, but I'm going to use it. But I'll quote you if someone asks,
It's yours now, brother. Take it as far as you can. I'm just saying. Misinformation experts, disinformation experts. And it's great to meet you through Paul Check. I'm a huge fan of his. I've seen a lot of his podcasts. I've met him a couple times. So thank you for doing the work you're doing. It's really amazing. I really appreciate it.
All right, Dave. Well, thank you again. Have a good weekend, and would love to stay in
you.
touch with you too. So if you need anything, just
Definitely.
reach out to me anytime. Okay.
I look forward to it. Have a great day.
Okay.
Take care.
All right, guys. Take care.
Thanks for tuning into the podcast. If you've ever had trouble losing weight, or you've lost weight, but still didn't have the ideal body or health you're aiming for, please feel free to reach out anytime and book an assessment. Eugene will work with you to cover your goals in detail, see what's holding you back, and go from there. In the meantime, feel free to check out the countless testimonials on Eugene's website in the link below. In the testimonial section, you'll notice everyone has various backgrounds, are of all different ages, and all have had different challenges in their life, but they all have one thing in common: they were all able to find their health and achieve their ideal body. You're also welcome to add yourself to the Facebook group in the link below. There you'll have access to the live videos that Eugene does weekly on Sundays, and other helpful content. Thank you again for tuning in.